Good day, dear listener, and welcome to my channel, podcast, or corner of YouTube. I haven't quite yet decided how I'm going to run this thing, but well done for finding me, and welcome. So, the sole purpose of this channel, and I guess I'll keep calling it that for now, is for you to put aside some quiet time, take a deep breath, relax, and listen to some stories. Some you may have heard of before, others you may not have done. To this end, the first minute or so of each episode will be a brief introduction to the stories I'm going to read and whatever other ramblings come into my head. This gives you time to get yourself settled and ready for the stories themselves. I'm aiming for each episode to last for around half an hour, hopefully long enough for a whole short story or a chapter or two of a longer work. Please leave us some comments telling me what you think of the channel, the stories, and suggest some things you might want to hear. Also like, subscribe and all that good stuff, as it encourages me to keep going. So, our first tale was written by Danish author Hans Christian Andersen in 1838, a classic fairy tale featuring a wicked queen, a brave princess and love conquering all, with the obligatory handsome princes and happy ever after. Enjoy. The Wild Swans. Far away, where the swallows take refuge in winter, lived a king who had 11 sons and one daughter, Elsie. The 11 brothers, they were all princes, used to go to school with stars upon their breasts and swords at their sides. They wrote upon golden slates with diamond pencils and could read just as well without a book as with one, so there was no mistake about their being real princes. Their sister Elsie sat upon a little footstool of looking glass, and she had a picture book which had cost half of a kingdom. Oh, these children were happy, but it was not to last thus forever. Their father, who was king all over the land, married a wicked queen who was not at all kind to the poor children. They found that out on the first day. All was festive at the castle, but when the children wanted to play at having company, instead of having as many cakes and baked apples as ever they wanted, she would only let them have some sand in a teacup and said they must make believe. In the following week she sent little Elsie into the country to board with some peasants, and it did not take long to make the king believe so many bad things about the boys that he cared no more about them. "Fly out into the world and look after yourselves," said the wicked queen. "You shall fly about like birds without voices." But she could not make things as bad for them as she would have liked. They turned into 11 beautiful wild swans. They flew out of the palace window and with a weird scream right across the park and the woods. It was very early in the morning when they came to the place where their sister Elsie was sleeping in the peasant's house. They hovered over the roof of the house, turning and twisting their long necks and flapping their wings. But no one either heard or saw them. They had to fly away again, and they soared up towards the clouds, far out into the wide world. And they settled in a big, dark wood, which stretched down to the shore. Poor little Elsie stood in the peasant's room, playing with a green leaf, for she had no other toys. She made a little hole in it, which she looked through at the sun, and it seemed to her as if she saw her brother's bright eyes. Every time the warm sunbeams shone upon her cheek, it reminded her of their kisses. One day passed just like another. When the wind whistled through the rose hedges outside the house, it whispered to the roses, "Who can be prettier than you are?" But the roses shook their heads and answered, "Elsie." And when the old woman sat in the doorways reading her psalms, the wind turned over the leaves and said to the book, "Who can be more pious than you?" "Elsie," answered the book. Both the roses and the book of psalms only spoke the truth. She was to go home when she was 15. But when the queen saw how pretty she was, she got very angry, and her heart was filled with hatred. She would willingly have turned it into a wild swan too, like her brothers, but she did not dare to do it at once, for the king wanted to see his daughter. The queen always went to the bath in the early mornings. It was built of marble and adorned with soft cushions and beautiful carpets. She took 3 toads, kissed them, and said to the first, "Sit upon Elsie's head when she comes to the bath, so that she may become sluggish like yourself." "Sit upon her forehead," she said to the second, so that she may become ugly like you, and then her father won't know her. Rest upon her heart, she whispered to the third. Let an evil spirit come over her, which may be a burden to her. Then she put the toads into the clean water, and a green tinge immediately came over it. She caught Elsie and dressed her and made her go to the bath. When she ducked under the water, one of the toads got among her hair, and the other got onto her forehead, and the third onto her bosom. But when she stood up, 3 scarlet poppies floated on the water. Had not the creatures been poisonous and kissed by the sorceress, they would have been changed into crimson roses, but yet they became flowers from merely having rested a moment upon her head and her heart. She was far too good and innocent for the sorcery to have any power over her. When the wicked queen saw this, she rubbed her over with walnut juice and smeared her face with some evil-smelling salve. She also matted up her beautiful hair. It would have been impossible to recognise pretty Elsie. When her father saw her, he was quite horrified and said that she could not be his daughter. Nobody would have anything to do with her, except the yard dog and the swallows, and they were only poor dumb animals whose opinions went for nothing. Poor Elsie wept and thought of her 11 brothers who were all lost. She crept sadly out of the palace and wandered about all day over meadows and marshes and into a big forest. She did not know in the least where she wanted to go, but she felt very sad and longed for her brothers, who, no doubt like herself, had been driven out of the palace. She made up her mind to go and look for them, but she had only been in the wood for a short time when night fell. She had quite lost her way, so she lay down upon the soft moss and said her evening prayer, and rested her head upon a little hillock. It was very still, and the air was mild. Hundreds of glowworms shone around her on the grass and in the marsh like green fire. When she gently moved one of the branches over her head, the little shining insects fell over her like a shower of stars. She dreamt about her brothers all night long. Again they were children playing together. They wrote upon the golden slates with their diamond pencils, and she looked at the picture book which had cost half a kingdom. But they no longer wrote strokes and noughts upon their slates as they used to. No, they wrote down all their boldest exploits, and everything they had seen and experienced. Everything in the picture book was alive. The birds sang, and the people walked out of the book and spoke to Elsie and her brothers. When she turned over a page, they skipped back into their places again, so that there should be no confusion among the pictures. When she woke, the sun was already high. It is true she could not see it very well through the thick branches of the lofty forest trees, but the sunbeams cast a golden shimmer around beyond the forest. There was a fresh, delicious scent of grass and herbs in the air, and the birds were almost ready to perch upon her shoulders. She could hear the splashing of water, for there were many springs around, which all flowed into a pond with a lovely sandy bottom. It was surrounded with thick bushes, but there was one place which the stags had trampled down, and Elsie passed through the opening into the waterside. It was so transparent that had not the branches been moved by the breeze, she must have thought that they were painted on the bottom, so plainly was every leaf reflected, both those on which the sun played and those which were in the shade. When she saw her own face, she was quite frightened. It was so dirty and ugly. But when she wet her little hand and rubbed her eyes and forehead, her skin shone through again. Then she took off all her clothes and went into the fresh water. A more beautiful royal child than she could not be found in all the world. When she had put her clothes on again and plaited her long hair, she went to a sparkling spring and drank some of the water out of the hollow of her hand. Then she wandered further into the wood, though where she was going she had not the least idea. She thought of her brothers, and she thought of a merciful God who would not forsake her. He let the wild crab-apples grow to feed the hungry. He showed her a tree, the branches of which were bending beneath the weight of the fruit. Here she made her midday meal, and, having put props under the branches, she walked on into the thickest part of the forest. It was so quiet that she heard her own footsteps. She heard every little withered leaf which bent under her feet. Not a bird was to be seen, not a ray of sunlight pierced the leafy branches. and the tall trunks were so close together that when she looked before her, it seemed as if a thick fence of heavy beams hemmed her in on every side. The solitude was such as she had never known before. It was a very dark night. Not a single glowworm sparkled in the marsh. Sadly, she lay down to sleep, and it seemed to her as if the branches above her parted asunder, and the Saviour looked down upon her with his loving eyes, and the little angels' heads peeped out above his head and under his arms. When she woke in the morning, she was not sure if she had dreamt this or whether it was really true. She walked a little further when she met an old woman with a basket full of berries, of which she gave her some. Elsie asked if she had seen 11 princes ride through the wood. "No," said the old woman, "but yesterday I saw 11 swans with golden crowns upon their heads, swimming in the stream close by here." She led Elsie a little further to the slope, at the foot of which the stream meandered. The trees on either bank stretched out their rich leafy branches towards each other, and where, from their natural growth, they could not reach each other, they had torn their roots out of the ground and leant over the water so as to interlace their branches. Elsie said goodbye to the woman and walked along by the river till it flowed out into the great open sea. The beautiful open sea lay before the maiden, but not a sail was to be seen on it, not a single boat. How was she ever to get any further? She looked at the numberless little pebbles on the beach. They were all worn quite round by the water. Glass, iron, stone, whatever was washed up, had taken their shapes from the water, which yet was much softer than her little hand. With all its rolling, it is untiring, and everything hard is smoothed down. I will be just as untiring. Thank you for your lesson, you clear rolling waves. Sometime, so my heart tells me, you will bear me to my beloved brothers. 11 white swans' feathers were lying on the seaweed. She picked them up and made a bunch of them. There were still drops of water on them. Whether these were dew or tears, no one could tell. It was very lonely there by the shore, but she did not feel it, for the sea was ever changing. There were more changes on it in the course of a few hours than could be seen on an inland freshwater lake in a year. If a big black cloud arose, it was just as if the sea wanted to say, "I can look black too." And then the wind blew up and the waves showed their white crests. But if the clouds were red and the wind dropped, the sea looked like a rose leaf, now white, now green. But however still it was, there was always a little gentle motion just by the shore. The water rose and fell softly like the bosom of a sleeping child. When the sun was just about to go down, Elsie saw 11 wild swans with golden crowns upon their heads flying towards the shore. They flew in a swaying line, one behind the other, like a white ribbon streamer. Elsie climbed up onto the bank and hid behind a bush. The swans settled close by her and flapped their great white wings. As soon as the sun had sunk beneath the water, the swans shed their feathers and became 11 handsome princes. They were Elsie's brothers, although they had altered a great deal. She knew them at once. She felt there must be her brothers, and she sprang into their arms, calling them by name. They were delighted when they recognised their little sister, who had grown so big and beautiful. They laughed and cried and told each other how wickedly their stepmother had treated them all. "We brothers," said the eldest, "have to fly about in the guise of swans as long as the sun is above the horizon. When it goes down, we regain our human shapes, so we always have to look out for a resting place near sunset, for should we happen to be flying amongst the clouds when the sun goes down, we should be hurled to the depths below. We do not live here. There is another land just as beautiful as this beyond the sea, but the way to it is very long, and we have to cross the mighty ocean to get to it. There is not a single island on the way where we can spend the night. Only one solitary little rock juts up above the water midway. It is only just big enough for us to stand upon close together, and if there is a heavy sea, the water splashes over us. Yet we thank our God for it. We stay there overnight in our human forms, and without it we could never revisit our beloved fatherland, for the flight takes 2 of the longest days in the year. We are only permitted to visit the home of our fathers once a year, and we dare only stay for 11 days. We hover over this big forest from whence we catch a glimpse of the palace where we were born and where our father lives. Beyond it we can see the high church towers where our mother is buried. We fancy that the trees and bushes here are related to us, and the wild horses gallop over the moors as we used to see them in our childhood. The charcoal burners still sing the old songs we used to dance to when we were children. This is our fatherland. We are drawn towards it, and here we have found you again, dear little sister. We may stay here 2 days longer, and then we must fly away again across the ocean to a lovely country indeed, but it is not our own dear fatherland. How shall we ever take you with us? We have neither ship nor boat." "How can I deliver you?" said their sister, and they went on talking to each other nearly all night. They only dozed for a few hours. Elsie was awakened in the morning by the rustling of the swan's wings above her. Her brothers were again transformed and were wheeling around in great circles till she lost sight of them in the distance. One of them, the youngest, stayed behind. He laid his head upon her bosom, and she caressed it with her fingers. They remained together all day. Towards evening the others came back, and as soon as the sun went down they took their natural forms. "Tomorrow we must fly away, and we dare not come back for a whole year. But we can't leave you like this. Have you courage to go with us? My arm is strong enough to carry you over the forest, so surely our united strength ought to be sufficient to bear you across the ocean." "Oh yes, take me with you," said Elsie. They spent the whole night weaving a kind of net from the elastic bark of the willow, bound together with tough rushes that made it both large and strong. Elsie lay down upon it, and when the sun rose and the brothers became swans again, they took up the net in their bills and flew high up amongst the clouds with their precious sister, who was fast asleep. The sunbeams fell straight onto her face, so one of the swans flew over her head so that its broad wings would shade her. They were far from land when Elsie woke. She thought she must still be dreaming. It seemed so strange to be carried through the air so high up above the sea. By her side lay a branch of beautiful ripe berries and a bundle of savoury roots, which her youngest brother had collected for her, and for which she gave him a grateful smile. She knew it was he who flew above her head, shading her from the sun. They were so high up that the first ship they saw looked like a gull floating on the water. A great cloud came up behind them like a mountain, and Elsie saw the shadow of herself on it, and those of the 11 swans looking like giants. It was more of a beautiful picture than any she had ever seen before, but as the sun rose higher, the cloud fell behind and the shadow picture disappeared. They flew on and on all day like an arrow whizzing through the air, but they went slower than usual, for now they had their sister to carry. A storm came up and the night was drawing on. Elsie saw the sun sinking with terror in her heart, for the solitary rock was nowhere to be seen. The swan seemed to be taking stronger strokes than ever. Alas, she was the cause of their not being able to get on faster. As soon as the sun went down, they would become men. They would all be hurled into the sea and drowned. She prayed to God from the bottom of her heart, but still no rock was to be seen. Black clouds gathered, and strong gusts of wind announced a storm. The clouds looked like a great threatening leaden wave, and the flashes of lightning followed each other rapidly. The sun was now at the edge of the sea. Elsie's heart quaked when suddenly the swans shot downwards so suddenly that she thought they were falling, and then they hovered again. Half of the sun was below the horizon, and there, for the first time, she saw the little rock below, which did not look bigger than the head of a seal above the water. The sun sank very quickly. It was no bigger than a star, but her foot touched solid earth. The sun went out like the last sparks of a bit of burning paper. She saw her brother stand arm in arm around her, but there was only just enough room for them. The waves beat upon the rock and washed over them like drenching rain. The heavens shone with continuous fire, and the thunder rolled peal upon peal, but the sisters and brothers held each other's hands and sang a psalm which gave them comfort and courage. The air was pure and still at dawn. As soon as the sun rose, the swans flew off with Elsie, away from the islet. The sea still ran high. It looked from where they were as if the white foam of the dark green water were millions of swans floating on the waves. When the sun rose higher, Elsie saw before her, half floating in the air, great masses of ice, with shining glaciers on the heights. A palace was perched midway, a mile in length, with one bold colonnade built above another. Beneath them swayed palm trees and gorgeous blossoms as big as mill wheels. She asked if this was the land to which they were going, but the swans shook their heads, because what she saw was a mirage, the beautiful and ever-changing palace of Fata Morgana. No mortal dared enter it. Elsie gazed at it, but as she gazed, the palace, gardens and mountains melted away, and in their place stood 20 proud churches with their high towers and pointed windows. She seemed to hear the notes of the organ, but it was the sea she heard. When she got close to the seeming churches, they changed to a great navy sailing beneath her, but it was only sea mist floating over the waters. Yes, she saw constant changes passing before her eyes, and now she saw the real land she was bound to. Beautiful blue mountains rose before her with their cedar woods and palaces. Long before the sun went down, she sat amongst the hills in front of a big cave covered with delicate green creepers. It looked like a piece of embroidery. "Now we shall see what you will dream here tonight," said the youngest brother, as he showed her where she was to sleep. "If only I might dream how I could deliver you," she said, and this thought filled her mind entirely. She prayed earnestly to God for his help, and even in her sleep she continued her prayer. It seemed to her that she was flying up to Fata Morgana in her castle in the air. The fairy came towards her. She was charming and brilliant, and yet she was very like the old woman who gave her the berries in the wood, and she told her about the swans with the golden crowns. "Your brothers can be delivered," she said, "but have you courage and endurance enough for it? The sea is indeed softer than your hands, and it moulds the hardest stones, but it does not feel the pain your fingers will feel. It has no heart and does not suffer the pain and anguish you must feel. Do you see the stinging nettle I hold in my hand? Many of this kind grow around the cave where you sleep. Only these and the ones which grow in the churchyard may be used. Mark that. Those you may pluck, although they will burn and blister your hands. Crush the nettles with your feet, and you will have flax, and of this you must weave 11 coats of mail with long sleeves. Throw these over the 11 wild swans, and the charm is broken. But remember that from the moment you begin this work till it is finished, even if it takes years, you must not utter a word. The first word you say will fall like a murderer's dagger into the hearts of your brothers. Their lives hang on your tongue. Mark this well." She touched her hand at the same moment. It was like burning fire and woke Elsie. It was bright daylight, and close to where she slept lay a nettle like those in her dreams. She fell upon her knees with thanks to God and left the cave to begin her work. She seized the horrid nettles with her delicate hands, and they burnt like fire. Great blisters rose on her hands and arms, but she suffered it willingly, if only it would deliver her beloved brothers. She crushed every nettle with her bare feet and twisted it into green flax. When the sun went down and the brothers came back, they were alarmed at finding her mute. They thought it was some new witchcraft exercised by their wicked stepmother, but when they saw her hands, they understood that it was for their sakes. The youngest brother wept, and wherever his tears fell, she felt no more pain, and the blisters disappeared. She spent the whole night at her work, for she could not rest until she had delivered her dear brothers. All the following day, whilst her brothers were away, she sat solitary, but never had the time flown so fast. One coat of mail was finished, and she began the next. Then a hunting horn sounded amongst the mountains. She was much frightened. The sound came nearer, and she heard dogs barking. In terror she rushed into the cave and tied the nettles she collected and woven into a bundle upon which she sat. At that moment a big dog bounded forward from the thicket, and another and another. They barked loudly and ran backwards and forwards. In a few minutes all the huntsmen were standing outside the cave. and the handsomest of them was the king of the country. He stepped up to Elsie. Never had he seen so lovely a girl. "How came you here, beautiful child?" he said. Elsie shook her head. She dared not speak. The salvation and lives of her brothers depended upon her silence. She hid her hands under her apron, so that the king should not see what she suffered. "Come with me," he said. "You cannot stay here. If you are as good as you are beautiful, I will dress you in silks and velvets and put a golden crown upon your head, and you shall live with me and have your home in my richest palace." Then he lifted her upon his horse. She wept and wrung her hands, but the king said, "I only think of your happiness. You will thank me one day for what I am doing." Then he darted off across the mountains, holding her before him on his horse, and the huntsman followed. When the sun went down, the royal city with churches and cupolas lay before them, and the king led her into the palace, where great fountains played in the marble halls, and where walls and ceilings were adorned with paintings. But she had no eyes for them. She only wept and sorrowed. Passively she allowed the women to dress her in royal robes, to twist pearls into her hair, and to draw gloves onto her blistered hands. She was dazzlingly lovely as she stood there in all her magnificence. The courtiers bent low before her, and the king wooed her as his bride, although the archbishop shook his head and whispered that he feared the beautiful wood maiden was a witch who had dazzled their eyes and infatuated the king. The king refused to listen to him, and he ordered the music to play, the richest foods to be bought, and the loveliest girls to dance before her. She was led through scented gardens into gorgeous apartments, but nothing brought a smile to her lips or into her eyes. Sorrow sat there like a heritage and a possession for all time. Last of all, the king opened the door of a little chamber close by the room where she was to sleep. It was adorned with costly green carpets and made to exactly resemble the cave where he had found her. On the floor lay the bundle of flax she had spun from the nettles, and from the ceiling hung the shirt of mail which was already finished. One of the huntsmen had brought all these things away as curiosities. "Here you may dream that you are back in your former home," said the king. "Here is the work on which you were engaged. In the midst of your splendour, it may amuse you to think of these times." When Elsie saw all of these things so dear to her heart, a smile for the first time played upon her lips, and the blood rushed back to her cheeks. She thought of the deliverance of her brothers, and she kissed the king's hand. He pressed her to his heart and ordered all of the church bells to ring marriage peals. The lovely dumb girl from the woods was to be the queen of the country. The archbishop whispered evil words into the ear of the king, but they did not reach his heart. The wedding was to take place, and the archbishop himself had to put the crown upon her head. In his anger he pressed the golden circlet so tightly upon her head as to give pain, but a heavier circlet pressed upon her heart, her grief for her brothers, so she thought nothing of the bodily pain. Her lips were sealed. A single word from her mouth would cost her brothers their lives, but her eyes were full of love for the good and handsome king, who did everything he could to please her. Every day she grew more and more attached to him, and longed to confide in him, to tell him of her suffering. But dumb she must remain, and in silence must bring her labour to completion. Therefore at night she stole away from his side into her secret chamber, which was decorated like a cave, and here she knitted one shirt after another. When she came to the 7th, all her flax was worked up. She knew that these nettles which she was to use grew in the churchyard, but she had to pluck them herself. How was she to get there? "Oh, what is the pain of my fingers compared with the anguish of my heart?" she thought. "I must venture out. The good God will not desert me." With as much terror in her heart as if she were doing some evil deed, she stole down one night into the moonlit garden, through the long alleys, and out into the silent streets, to the churchyard. There she saw, sitting on a gravestone, a group of hideous ghouls who took off their tattered garments as if they were about to bathe, and then dug down into the freshly made graves with their skinny fingers, and tore the flesh from the bodies and devoured it. Elsie had to pass close by them, and they fixed their evil eyes upon her, but she said a prayer as she passed, picking the stinging nettles, and hurried back to the palace with them. Only one person saw her, but that was the archbishop, who watched while others slept. Surely now all his bad opinions of the queen were justified. All was not as it should be with her. She must be a witch, and therefore she had bewitched the king and all the people. He told the king in the confessional what he had seen and what he feared. When those bad words passed his lips, the pictures of the saints shook their heads as if to say, "No, it is not so. Elsie is innocent." The archbishop, however, took it differently and thought that they were bearing witness against her and shaking their heads at her sin. 2 big tears rolled down the king's cheeks, and he went home with doubt in his heart. He pretended to sleep at night, but no quiet sleep came to his eyes. He perceived how Elsie got up and went to her private closet. Day by day his face grew darker. Elsie saw it, but could not imagine what the cause of it was. She had, however, almost reached the end of her labours. Only 1 shirt of mail was wanting, but again she had no more flax, and not a single nettle was left. Once more, for the last time, she must go to the churchyard to pluck a few handfuls. She thought with dread of the solitary walk and the horrible ghouls, but her will was strong. Elsie went, but the king and the archbishop followed her. They saw her disappear within the grated gateway of the churchyard. When they followed, they saw the ghouls sitting on the gravestone, as Elsie had seen them before, and the king turned away his head, because he thought she was among them, she whose head this very evening had rested on his breast. "The people must judge her," he groaned, and the people judged. "Let her be consumed in the glowing flames." She was led away from her beautiful royal apartments to a dark, damp dungeon where the wind whistled through the grated window. Instead of velvet and silk, they gave her the bundle of nettles she had gathered to lay her head upon. The hard, burning shirts of mail were to be her covering, but they could have given her nothing more precious. She set to work again with many prayers to God. Outside her prison, the street boys sang derisive songs about her, and not a soul comforted her with kind words. Towards evening, she heard the rustle of swans' wings close to her window. It was her younger brother. At last he had found her. He sobbed aloud with joy, although he knew that the coming night must be her last. But then her work was almost done, and her brothers were there. The archbishop came to spend her last hours with her, as he had promised the king. She shook her head at him, and by looks and gestures begged him to leave her. She had only this night in which to finish her work, or else all would be wasted. Her pain, tears, and sleepless nights. The archbishop went away with bitter words against her, but poor Elsie knew that she was innocent, and she went back to her work. The little mice ran about the floor, bringing nettles to her feet, so as to give her what help they could, and a thrush sat upon the grating of the window, where he sang all night, as merrily as he could, to keep up her courage. It was still only dawn, and the sun would not rise for an hour, when the 11 brothers stood at the gate of the palace, begging to be taken to the king. This could not be done, was the answer, for it was still night, the king was asleep, and no one dared wake him. All their entreaties and threats were useless. The watch turned out, and eventually even the king himself came to see what was the matter. But just then the sun rose, and no more brothers were to be seen, only 11 wild swans hovering over the palace. The whole populace streamed out of the town gates. They were all anxious to see the witch burned. A miserable horse drew the cart in which Elsie was seated. They had put upon her a smock of green sacking, and all her beautiful long hair hung loose from her lovely head. Her cheeks were deathly pale, and her lips moved softly, whilst her fingers unceasingly twisted the green yarn. Even on the way to her death, she could not abandon her unfinished work. 10 shirts lay completed at her feet. She laboured away at the 11th amid the scoffing insults of the populace. "Look at the witch, how she mutters. She has never had a book of psalms in her hand. No, there she sits with her loathsome sorcery. Tear it away from her, into 1,000 bits." The crowd pressed around her to destroy her work. But just then 11 white swans flew down and perched upon the cart, flapping their wings. The crowd gave way before them in terror. "It's a sign from heaven. She is innocent," they whispered, but they dared not say it aloud. The executioner seized her by the hand, but she hastily threw the 11 shirts over the swans, who were immediately transformed into 11 handsome princes. But the youngest had a swan's wing in place of an arm, for one sleeve was wanting to his shirt of mail. She had not been able to finish it. "Now I may speak. I am innocent." The populace who saw what had happened bowed down before her as if she had been a saint, but she sank lifeless in her brother's arms, so great had been the strain, the terror, and the suffering she had endured. "Yes, innocent she is indeed," said the eldest brother, and he told them all what had happened. Whilst he spoke, a lovely fragrance spread around them as of a million roses. Every log in the pile had taken root and shot out branches. A great high hedge of red roses arose. At the very top was one pure white blossom. It shone like a star, and the king broke it off and laid it in Elsie's bosom, and she woke with such joy and peace in her heart. All the church bells began to ring of their own accord, and singing birds flocked around them. A bridal procession such as no one had ever seen headed back to the king's palace. The end.